Welcome to Talking Point from the Church's Fellowship for Psychical and Spiritual Studies.
Angels and Archetypes. Christopher Bryant, SSJE. Father Bryant is a priest of the Society of St. John the Evangelist, editor of New Fire, and has for long been a student of C.G. Jung. This article appeared in the September 1984 edition of the Christian Parapsychologist Journal, and may reflect the language and attitudes of the time in which it was written. Responsibility for opinions expressed herein rests solely with the author, and such opinions must not be taken to represent those of the CFPSS. This article approaches the subject of angels by a psychological route. Psychology can, of course, neither prove nor disprove the objective reality of angels. This can only be determined, if indeed it can be, by a critical study of the evidence. In my opinion, the evidence for the reality of a spiritual world and of spiritual beings within it, coexisting with, and influencing the world of space and time in which we live, but not subject to its laws, is very strong. Here I shall assume without argument the existence of angelic beings and consider the ways by which people may sometimes perceive them. Jung has used the term archetype to denote part of the psychic mechanism by which we grasp reality. According to Jung, the archetype is an inborn tendency to recognize and respond to specific images. It is closely bound up with instinct and might be described as the perceptive and discriminating factor within instinct. The newborn infant, for example, largely through hands, nose, and mouth, perceives his mother's breast as a source of food. It is probable that something similar occurs in the subhuman animal kingdom and that the nest-making instinct of the thrush, the migratory urge of the swallow, the spawning of salmon, and the extraordinarily complex behavior of ants, wasps, and other insects are triggered by the stimulus of specific images. But the archetypal intuition is not limited in human beings to the recognition of what is biologically useful. It further responds to the image as a symbol pointing to realities and meanings far beyond the range of biological instinct. This becomes clearer as we reflect on the complex act of seeing and on the mind's part in it. The infant thrust naked out of the darkness of the womb into the strange bright world can at first make nothing of the confused blur of light that impinges on the retina of the eye. Only gradually does he learn to identify objects by sight. Seeing is by no means only a matter of sense perception. It is just as much a mental act by which the individual learns to sort out the patterns of light which fall upon the retina into images which roughly correspond with people and objects out there. Seeing is a projection upon the external world of the light patterns which strike the eye. As the child slowly learns to identify the objects around him and to recognize their names, he begins increasingly to grasp the reality of the world outside him. At the same time, he has a vivid dream and fantasy life which at first he cannot easily distinguish from the real world. As he grows older, his inner life is enriched and expanded by fairy stories and tales of adventure which express the collective experiences and wisdom of the race. Although it is of the greatest importance for the child to respond to the interests and demands of the everyday world and to grow in time into a responsible adult, it would be a gross mistake to suppose that the inner world of dream and fantasy is simply unreal. For the world of dream and story illuminates and gives depth to the humdrum reality of everyday. It is also the medium through which individuals who have become firmly rooted in the earthly city can grasp the reality of a spiritual world, interacting with it and interpenetrating it. Jung's theory of archetypes sheds light on this inner world. These innate meaning-seeking instincts shape and structure the psychic energy which, like a river, flows along channels pre-formed by the experience of countless generations. The archetypal images, transmitted partly by myth and folklore, partly by story and religious ritual, split the psychic energy into relatively autonomous complexes of emotion and habit, which cohere around an image, as for example that of mother or father. Each image-centered complex tends to form a kind of subpersonality, which appears in dreams personified as a man or woman, perhaps, or even as an animal. These subpersonalities exercise a real, though hidden, influence on the individual's thoughts and actions, sometimes reinforcing them, sometimes thwarting them. The inner image is a means of insight into the external world, but at the same time a source of illusion. It is important to keep in mind the psychic mechanism of this dual effect, for it could be highly relevant to the difficult task of discriminating between the true and the false in the apparent visions of spiritual beings such as angels. As we have seen, we grasp realities outside us partly through a process of interpretation which takes place, largely unconsciously, in the mind and not simply through the senses. I perceive and form opinions about another person partly through my own inner reactions to him. It is largely through the window of my own thoughts, feelings, and images that I form an estimate of other people. If I have a strong prejudice for or against another, especially if I am unaware of its strength, my judgment of him is bound to be distorted. I shall inevitably project, onto the other, feelings or ideas that are really in myself. It is well known that an angry man will often accuse another falsely of having lost his temper. He is projecting his own anger onto the other. Nevertheless, though projection is usually understood as a distorting medium, the very same psychological mechanism that may lead me to misjudge an individual, through seeing him through the spectacles of my prejudice, can also make possible a genuine insight into his character. Sometimes people try to explain away alleged visions of spirits or angels as just the projection of mental fantasies onto the real world. The possibility of this should make us cautious in accepting every alleged vision of angels as genuine. But the fact of projection does not in itself prove that what is projected is illusory. We need to look for ways of discriminating between projection as illusory and projection as giving real insight. One important consideration here will be the extent to which the vision fits in with, or contradicts, what is known or believed on other grounds. Let us turn from such general considerations to face the question of how spirits would communicate with people of our space-time world. This would presumably be through a kind of telepathic pressure upon individual psyches. This would be unconsciously translated into images or words fashioned according to the presuppositions of the individual's culture. This psychic pressure might be perceived by an individual as a figure in a dream sufficiently vivid to be remembered on waking. Or he might become conscious of it as a waking vision. Further, it might be projected onto an actual person belonging to the individual's daily life. Most of the many visions of angels recorded in the Bible would fit in with this psychic mechanism. The Bible, in common with most of the ancient world, takes for granted the existence of spirits. Where the Bible is distinctive is in seeing them in relation to, and under the rule of, the living God, the Creator. The Bible understands the angel as the agent and messenger of God. Thus angels appeared to the patriarch Abraham to tell him of the coming destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and later called down fire and brimstone from heaven to destroy those cities. In some passages of the Bible, the angel of the Lord is so closely associated with God himself as to be virtually indistinguishable from him. Thus the destruction of the Egyptian armies in the Red Sea is sometimes ascribed to God, sometimes to the angel of the Lord. Angels bring home to men and women of this time-bound world the reality of God and sometimes declare his will with convincing signs. When the angel Gabriel appeared to Zacharias, while on duty in the temple, to announce the coming birth of his son, John the Baptist, the old man at first doubted the truth of the prophecy on account of his and his wife's advanced age. The sign given to convince him of the authenticity of the message was the sign of dumbness. The message was so astonishing that a merciful aphasia deprived him of the power to discuss the vision and so weaken its impression. Similarly, when St. Paul had his vision on the road to Damascus, he was temporarily blinded. Later, when he described this experience before the Sanhedrin, some of the Pharisees present assumed that he had seen an angel. Especially in the New Testament, angels are seen as agents under God in the work of man's salvation. This salvation is the work of grace, that is of the active loving-kindness of God reaching out to men and women and evoking the response of faith. From the human standpoint, the function of angels is to be ministers of grace. Angels help to make grace visible and thus enable human faith. The angel Gabriel appeared to Mary to announce her unique vocation and make possible her response, "Behold the handmaid of the Lord, be it unto me according to thy word." The vision of angels worshipping, even the mental image of angels worshipping, can awaken a sense of the numinous and bring home something of the unimaginable majesty of God. The sense of the numinous is awakened, for example, by the hymn which in its English translation opens with the words, "Let all mortal flesh keep silence, and in fear and trembling stand, at his feet the six-winged seraph, cherubim with sleepless eye, veil their faces to the presence, as with ceaseless voice they cry, Alleluia, 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 Lord Most High." It is probable that all unknowingly, we benefit by the ministry of angels who do their work in the unconscious levels of the mind which are in touch with the psychic world. What are we to say about evil spirits, rebellious angels? Or of Satan himself? In the Bible, Satan and the demons are all subject to the rule of God and can only act by his permission. They are God's creatures and ultimately serve God's purposes. The word Satan means adversary, and in the Old Testament he is the spirit sent by God to test men. The best known instance of this is in the book of Job. In the New Testament, Satan appears to act independently of God, but always in such a way as to serve God's purposes. The Bible, which assumes God to be the author and ruler of all that exists, sees God as ultimately responsible for evil. "I form the light and create darkness, I make peace and create evil." Isaiah 45:7. An early Christian view, found in a work ascribed to Clement, Bishop of Rome towards the end of the 1st century, is that God metes out good with his right hand and evil with his left. Our modern sensibility rebels at this ascription of evil to God. But to deny that God is responsible for evil, in the sense that he has created a dangerous world and beings capable of evil, is to deny that God is the creator. But turning away from the insoluble problem of the origin of evil, we can find in Jung's ideas and writings much that can illuminate the reality of a destructive element within human life. Jung speaks of an inner adversary within each individual, which he calls the shadow. The development of this inner adversary takes place as the individual in the process of growing up tries to put away his childish behavior and passions, the blind rages and fears, the passionate loves and hates, the joys and despairs of infancy and childhood. These rejected emotions and desires do not die, but form a kind of underground resistance movement, threatening the rule of the conscious personality. It is the task of the individual, once he has attained sufficient maturity and strength, to face these shadow forces, to acknowledge their reality, but not to allow them to rule his aims and actions. For, confronted in this way, these apparent adversaries will to a great extent become allies, to the great enrichment and strengthening of the individual. Jung further postulates an archetypal shadow, a kind of collective, racial force of evil, which is far too strong for the individual to assimilate and must be resisted, if he is not to be taken over and dominated by it. Some of the barbarities of history, of which the most recent is the Nazi Holocaust of 6 million Jews, seem to be far worse than can be accounted for by the wickedness of unscrupulous individuals. It is as though some evil influence takes possession of people no worse than the average and leads them to act with diabolical cruelty. There is an age-old belief that demonic agencies interfere in the affairs of mankind and sometimes take possession of individuals. Psychology has by no means disproved this belief. To lay bare the psychological mechanisms by which men and women can be dehumanized, no more rules out the interference of demons than does the recognition of the psychological factor in simple sight disprove the fact that what we seem to see is really there. There are too many strange facts which psychology cannot account for without denying or ignoring some of the evidence. Psychology has shed light on the human factor in psychic experience and has asked some searching questions which it cannot itself answer.
You have been listening to Talking Point from the Church's Fellowship for Psychical and Spiritual Studies. To find out more, please visit www.churchesfellowship.co.uk.